we have a very interesting lecture today. I invite Mr. Prem Ayyathurai, speaker for the day, to the dais, the chairman of the English Welfare Committee, and I request our chairman of the English Welfare Committee to offer the welcome address and introduce the guests.
Today's chief guest, Mr. Prem Ayyathurai, Advocate, Madurai Bench of Madras High Court, our President, Mr. Isaac Mohanlal, Senior Advocate, Mr. Ajmal Khan, office bearers of MMBA, including Librarian Mr. Mohammed Atif, members of MMBA, friends, senior advocates, and everybody. Great good evening to everybody. Before I welcome Mr. Prem Ayyathurai, I should thank two personalities here, without whose help it would not have been possible for me to identify, to choose, to make our young talented person, Mr. Prem Ayyathurai, to ornate the stage today. In Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, Antony says, if Caesar says, it is performed. If Caesar says, do this, it is performed. Likewise, here in MMBA, if our President, Mr. Isaac Mohanlal, says, do this, our Librarian, Mr. Atif, shows that it is performed. The express intention of our President is that young, talented persons practicing in Madurai Bench of Madras High Court should be identified, should be given chance to make display of their talents in the platforms like this. Just he has expressed his intention, Mr. Atif has identified today's chief guest, Mr. Prem Ayyathurai. And not only that, he has chosen him, he has invited him, he has made him to come over here to be amidst today. Therefore, I have to be thankful to our President as well as to our librarian. Mr. Prem Ayyathurai, according to Mr. Atif, is a best orator in English language. He is a best speaker, according to Mr. Atif. And our chief guest had his education in Maharashtra and had his +1, +2 in Pune. He did his BA LLB honors in National School of Law University, Bangalore. Not only that, he completed the course in the year 2014. He enrolled himself as an advocate in the state of Maharashtra and Goa. He practiced there in Bombay for nearly 5 years in corporate law and business banking laws. And then in the year 2019, he came to Madurai and he became junior to our efficient, able, respected, revered senior advocate, Mr. Ajmal Khan. He is not only enriched by being a junior to Mr. Ajmal Khan, and also he is enriching the office by his talent. It is my simple opinion. And then the notable feature in his professional aspiration is that he was an opening speaker in the winning team of 2012 Manfred Last Space Law Moot Court Compensation conducted in Naples, Italy. And thus he was having a beautiful experience to make argument before 3 sitting judges of the International Court of Justice. Thus, he is having rich experience in various fields. And our librarian, Mr. Atif, when he invited our chief guest, our librarian made a salutary and salubrious suggestion to our chief guest that our intention is not to cabin or confine the principles and doctrines of Dr. Ambedkar within the narrow stretch of region, religion, and everything, whatever it may be. And it is true, because we, the mankind, have become from anthropocentric to ecocentric. Since we have become from anthropocentric to ecocentric to protect the global, other eccentrics based upon communalism, religion, everything will fade away into nothingness. Therefore, today, we have a different aspect. We are having a different altitude and attitude to listen to our great speaker. With this, I conclude my welcome address, and I welcome our chief guest and every one of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I welcome our chief speaker of the day, Mr. Prem Ayyathurai, to address us on the topic Ambedkarian Constitutionalism.
Thank you, sir, for the introduction. I don't think I deserved that bombastic an introduction, but I appreciate the kindness. Good evening. And at the very outset, I would like to exercise my gratitude to Isaac, sir, and to all the office bearers of the MMBA, and also to my senior who has made time to be present here, to other seniors, and to my colleagues for taking time out today to attend this talk. Now, I myself completely understand the hurry that we tend to feel after court to go back to office. So I will confine my talk as far as possible, make it quicker than I actually intended to. The topic for today's talk is Ambedkarian constitutionalism. Atif suggested this topic, and it's an interesting question. What is Ambedkarian constitutionalism over and above just constitutionalism? Ironically, last night while preparing for this, there was news that in South Korea the president declared martial law. Of course, within hours the martial law was withdrawn. But a situation like this makes us appreciate even more the fact that we are living in this country governed by this rule of law under this constitution, and makes us appreciate the Indian constitution better. 26th of November was the 75th anniversary of the passing of the Constitution of India. 3/4 centuries have elapsed, and it is safe to say that one could say it's a stereotypical statement, but it's also true in that the Indian Constitution is a living document, and beautifully so. In fact, recently there was the order of the Supreme Court in Dr. Balram Singh versus Union of India in 2024 SEC Online 3433, where an attack was made to the 42nd Amendment and the inclusion of the terms secular and socialist in the preamble. Of course, it was dismissed, but it's quite interesting to look at the grounds on which it was dismissed. The Honorable Supreme Court states in paragraph 3 that the Constitution is a living document, and merely because the argument of retrospectivity, a subsequent amendment, cannot be used to assail the inclusion of these terms in the preamble. But more importantly, in paragraph 5, the judge says, the word socialism in the Indian context should not be interpreted as restricting the economic policies of an elected government of the people's choice at a given time. Neither the Constitution nor the preamble mandates a specific economic policy or structure, whether left or right. Rather, socialist denotes the state's commitment to a welfare state. Now, coming back then to the question of what is an Ambedkarian constitutionalism, this idea of the term socialist in the preamble, which did not exist when it was initially drafted, does align with what I believe is a very simple and succinct statement by Dr. Ambedkar himself. I believe that, to invoke his words, it comes in two places, which I'll take you through. One in his submissions to the Round Table Conference in 1931 and 1932, and one again in the discussion before the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly, in fact the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee in 1946-47. The concept is one man, one value, not one man, one vote. And I will cycle back to this concept a bit later. At the outset, I would like to say that typically when people discuss the life and work of Dr. Ambedkar, the stress is on a lot of the difficulties and challenges the great doctor faced in his life. And truly he did. But personally, as a student of law and history as well, also of Dr. Ambedkar, I believe that his story is not one of struggle, but one of prevailing against the challenges that one faces. And like Sir said, strongly I believe that Dr. Ambedkar is not just an individual whose contributions or identity should be cribbed and limited to one or another group of individuals in the country. It is a legacy that we all can legitimately lay claim to. Of course, from his childhood years, to give a certain background, Dr. Ambedkar graduated from the Elphinstone School and Elphinstone College in Bombay between the years 1900 and 1908. From the very earliest instance, he had to face a lot of challenges, sometimes even discouraging statements from the individuals who guided and taught him. However, of course, as history was to bear witness, he would become one of India's most highly educated pre-independence leaders, eventually getting degrees from Columbia and the London School of Economics. Initially, his talent was taken note of by the Raja of Baroda, which is a small princely state in the state of present-day Gujarat. And he was given a limited scholarship to go abroad and pursue his higher studies, with the understanding that he'll return and serve the state of the Prince of Baroda. After he returned in 1917, having completed his studies at Columbia and London School of Economics, he did begin to serve the state of Baroda to repay the scholarship that he had been granted. But within the very early days, he faced certain difficulties, certain discrimination in that state, and disappointed, unable to discharge his service, he came back to Bombay. In Bombay, he joined as a faculty at Sydenham College as the professor of political economy. Even there, he faced a lot of difficulties from his colleagues and even students. But the beginning of his political career was taking shape even in those years. In 1919, he presented evidence before the Southborough Committee regarding franchise in the nascent colonial India, which was taking steps towards dominion status. In doing so, and all of his writing and political mobilization, he gained the attention of another princely state, which was the state of Kolhapur. And the Prince of Kolhapur, Chhatrapati Shahu Maharaj, then gave him support, financial assistance, using which Dr. Ambedkar established the fortnightly called Mukh Nayak, the voice of the voiceless, and started organizing large-scale conferences and mobilizations of the all India depressed classes in Nagpur. With the money that he saved from the salary and the funding that he got from Shahu Maharaj, Dr. Ambedkar was able to return to London in 1920. He earned his MSc and DSc in economics and also his law degree. In fact, he also had a short stint in Germany, which a lot of people may not be aware of, where he studied and learnt Sanskrit, which he employed to great effect while studying the ancient Indian texts as a part of his political theorization and writing in the subsequent years. When he returned to Bombay, he enrolled to practice, or he sought to enroll to practice, but he was unable to pay the registration fees before the Bombay High Court. His friend Namal Bhatena loaned him 500 rupees at that point in time. He started taking up cases for the people who could not afford. He also started taking up cases for various political individuals, including Bal Gangadhar Tilak's brother at one point in time. Of course, he went up against Bal Gangadhar Tilak at that point in time. In this subsequent stage of his career, he started associating and working with, amongst others, even Congress leadership to launch satyagrahas, very much in the line of Gandhian politics, including the very famous Mahad Satyagraha in 1927, where he went to a tank and drank water. But at this point in time, a certain degree of disillusionment also crept into his understanding of Indian politics, which is that he was getting support from the people, but the Congress was not supporting him because, of course, he was an up-and-coming leader, who could potentially split votes. It was in this situation in 1927 that he was appointed a member of the Legislative Assembly in Bombay province for 5 years, and that was extended for another 5 years. It was in this capacity that he submitted written submissions to the Simon Commission in 1928. What is very interesting at that point in time in his career is that, of course, today people remember Dr. Ambedkar as the individual who, in the roundtable conferences and by virtue of the Pune Pact, asked for separate electorates, independent and separate from the Hindu majority in India. But the fact is that before the Simon Commission, Dr. Ambedkar argued for joint electorates and specifically opposed the concept of separate electorates. Specifically, he said, from these suggestions, it will be seen that I am for the abolition of all class electorates. Territorial electorates and separate electorates are two extremes which must be avoided in any scheme of representation that may be devised for the introduction of a democratic form of government in this most undemocratic country. The question then arises, why by the time Dr. Ambedkar went to the roundtable conference, he had shifted from a position of asking for joint electorates to separate electorates? I will not delve too deep into this question. The reason I'm sharing this evolution of his politics is to point out and underscore that throughout the various years in which he served the people in India, he was always open to the changing reality of politics in the ground, and his intention was forever to find a solution to ensure effective representation for the people who until then were not receiving that kind of representation in the nascent political atmosphere of pre-colonial India. So the shift from joint electorates to separate electorates. Of course, ironically, in the roundtable conference, Dr. Ambedkar stated that he was nominated to the roundtable conferences. He was not elected. But even then he said, even if it was by way of election, I would find a place here. I fully represent the claims of my community. Of course, up against him was the political giant, the father of India, Mohanlal Karamchand Gandhi, who independently claimed that in his own individual person, he had the right to represent all of the depressed classes, as they were then called, of India. The result of the roundtable conference was, of course, what was called the Communal Award, where the then British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald granted a certain number of separate electorate seats to the depressed classes members of India. Against this so-called Communal Award, Mr. Karamchand Gandhi declared a fast unto death. Faced with tremendous pressure, Dr. Ambedkar compromised, and they came at a mutual understanding. Instead of the 70 odd seats that were allotted for separate electorates, 151 seats would be allotted to the depressed classes of India, and there would be joint electorates, or there would be a two-step election process for it. A mutual compromise was arrived at. The outcome of the Pune Pact showed itself in the elections of the years 1937 and 1946, where the Congress achieved tremendous majority in the elections, and Dr. Ambedkar's party, the Independent Labour Party in 1937 or the All India Scheduled Caste Federation in 1946, were not able to assert electoral victory in order to be able to represent the depressed classes of India. There's a very interesting extract from a speech that Dr. Ambedkar gives in 1951 in Ludhiana, where he warns the people about the nature of representation and what is the meaning of effective representation. So, and I quote, "I want to tell you about the people who were elected to the Parliament and Congress seats, to the seats reserved for the scheduled castes. They were about 13 number, and in the Parliament for the last 4 years. not a single member out of the 30 raised any question in the parliament about the grievances of the scheduled castes. He goes on to detail the number of resolutions they passed or they did not pass and how they would behave in the legislature. The concern that he was raising was essentially that even though individuals were being elected, they were not effective representatives of the people. In fact, therefore, when the Cabinet Mission Plan decided on the mode for appointment of members to the Constituent Assembly, the reality is that Dr. Ambedkar stood for elections in Maharashtra and lost those elections. Having no choice, he was placed in a very uncomfortable position. In West then Bengal, there was another giant leader of the scheduled castes named Jogendranath Mandal. There is an extract of a small article in a book named Ambedkar, The Attendant Details. Mr. Mandal says, in the year 1946, the British government for election of members to the Constituent Assembly. Babasaheb Dr. Ambedkar came to Calcutta to seek the support of the European members of the Bengal Legislative Assembly. But when the European members expressed their decision not to participate in the election, Babasaheb became dejected and told me there was no chance for him to be elected to the Constituent Assembly. Subsequently, it is Jogendranath Mandal who mobilized the cadre of the All India Scheduled Caste Federation in Bengal and ensured the election of Dr. Ambedkar. There is an interesting aside to this point, because even I was not aware of this until I read upon it. Mr. Jogendranath Mandal was himself a prominent political leader in Bengal, and he was initially, at the time of partition, just before it, when there was a big question mark whether the All India Muslim League would participate in the Constituent Assembly, he participated with the All India Muslim League and joined the Constituent Assembly. And he was, in fact, the first law minister at that point in time in the integrated government. And subsequently, he also served in the Pakistan government and then came back to India. It is interesting as an insight to me that the first law ministers in both the governments of India and Pakistan were members of scheduled caste, which goes to show that democracy was robust from the very beginning and an intentional effort was made to represent all sections of society. Having said that, the most important twist in the tale, of course, is that though Dr. Ambedkar struggled to get elected to the Constituent Assembly, it was the father of the nation, Mr. Gandhi, who ensured that behind the scenes, who ensured that the Congress would appoint him as a president of the chairman of the drafting committee. Now the question becomes, what happened in the drafting committee? I have collected some material, but I will keep it as limited as possible. There's a very interesting point, and I'll stick to it, in light of the judgment of the Supreme Court on the challenge to the word socialist. In the Constituent Assembly, various committees and subcommittees were established. They include, of course, the drafting committee, but subordinate to the drafting committee were, amongst other committees, the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee. Dr. Ambedkar was, of course, a member in the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee. And as a part of his proposals, he published an article called States and Minorities. When we ask ourselves, what is an Ambedkarite constitution? Some may refer to the states and minorities, because in the states and minorities, Dr. Ambedkar lays down certain proposals of what he feels were provisions that should be incorporated in the constitution of independent India. In that, there is an Article 2, Section 2, remedy against invasion of fundamental rights, which in Clause 4 says, the United States of India, of course in his draft it was called the United States of India, shall declare as a part of the law of its constitution that industries which are key industries or which may be declared to be key industries shall be owned and run by the state. The industries which are not key industries but which are basic industries, shall be owned by the state and be run by the state or corporations established by the state. Agriculture shall be a state industry, so on and so forth. A very innovative concept was incorporated by Dr. Ambedkar in States and Minorities when it came to land redistribution, because we are aware about the evolution of the notion of compensation for land acquisition in Indian law. But in 1947 itself, Dr. Ambedkar said that if land is acquired from any landowners, debentures must be issued to them by the government. These debentures should distribute compensation payment over years to the landowners. Interest must also be given to the debenture holders, and these debentures must be heritable and transferable, an innovative mechanic to compensate landowners. There is an explanation in States and Minorities for why Dr. Ambedkar makes such aggressive suggestions, insisting on collectivization and essentially socialism. He explains, the main purpose behind the clause is to put an obligation on the state to plan the economic life of the people on lines which would lead to the highest point of productivity without closing every avenue to private enterprise, and also provide for equitable distribution of wealth. He says, state socialism is essential for rapid industrialization of India. Private enterprise cannot do it, and if it were allowed to do it, the inequalities of wealth of Europe would be reproduced in India. He says, consolidation of holdings and tenancy legislation are worse than useless. They cannot bring about prosperity in agriculture. The plan has two special features. One is that it proposes state socialism in the field of economic life. The second is that it does not leave the establishment of state socialism to the will of the legislature. So what is important here is, in his proposal, the economic model of the nation is incorporated as a mandate in the constitution itself. He himself poses the question. He says, students of constitutional law will at once raise a protest. They are sure to ask, does not this proposal go beyond the scope of fundamental rights? Therefore, he goes on to explain, political democracy rests on four premises which may be set out in the following terms. The individual is an end in himself. The individual has certain inalienable rights which must be guaranteed to him by the Constitution. The individual shall not be required to relinquish any of his constitutional rights as a condition precedent to the receipt of a privilege. And the state shall not delegate powers to the private persons to govern others. I'll not go further into the explanation, but in a sense what he tries to say is that if the state does not mandate the manner of economic relations inter se individuals, then private capital will come and do it in any case. And so, if India is to be reorganized on progressive lines, it is critical that this constitution mandates that the state socialism exists. He specifically observes that the alternative to this is dictatorship, if such a mandate is not incorporated in parliamentary democracy. And so the problem is to have state socialism without dictatorship, and state socialism with parliamentary democracy. And the way out seems to be to retain parliamentary democracy and to prescribe state socialism as a law of the constitution. This is a far cry from what ended up happening, of course, in the drafting of the constitution. But this is not to say that the proposals of Dr. Ambedkar were defeated. My point is that while Dr. Ambedkar placed his proposals before the drafting committee, and in the minutes of the committee, you can see that these proposals were voted against and defeated. He did not step back and refuse to participate. He did not go out and criticize the government for the refusal to accept his proposals, at least insofar as he was a member of the Constituent Assembly. Subsequently, he was critical. He participated and steered the Constitution through the Constituent Assembly. There's an interesting extract in a book named Ambedkar's Preamble, A Secret History of the Constitution of India. In that the author is Akash Singh Rathod. The author says, as T.T. Krishnamachari, a member of the drafting committee and author of the memoirs and audio recorded interviews that offer an inside look, himself detailed, out of the 7 original members of the drafting committee, one died, D.P. Khaitan. One was away in the United States. Krishnamachari was referring to B.N. Rao here, who was a constitutional law expert, who was not actually a member. One was engaged in the affairs of the state, N. Gopalaswamy Iyengar. Two, Mr. Muhammad Sadullah and Madhav Rao could not be in Delhi owing to ill health. In short, Krishnamachari claimed that 5 of the key persons actually had either little or no contribution in the drafting process. And as far as the drafting and finalization of the preamble and other parts of the constitution are concerned, there were only 4 members present in early meetings and only 3 in the final meeting. One, of course, was Dr. Ambedkar, who never missed a single meeting. So far, so good. What happened after the constitution was adopted? There are a lot of politically conscious individuals who specifically mention one statement made by Dr. Ambedkar, in which he expresses unhappiness with the constitution. But I would like to juxtapose it with certain facts. Of course, that statement is, I'm quite prepared to say that I shall be the first person to burn it. I do not want it. It does not suit anybody. This was a statement made by Dr. Ambedkar in Rajya Sabha in September 1953. But it has to be seen in the right context. On November 25, 1949, Dr. Ambedkar said in the Constituent Assembly, I came into the Constituent Assembly with no greater aspiration than to safeguard the interests of the scheduled caste. I was therefore greatly surprised when the Assembly elected me to the drafting committee. I was more than surprised when the drafting committee elected me to be its chairman. I'm grateful to the Constituent Assembly and the drafting committee to have chosen me as their instrument and given me this opportunity of serving the country. Yes, a statement was made by him in 1953 where he was critical of the Constitution. The context is this. In 1953, the Rajya Sabha was debating the bill to create the state of Andhra Pradesh. In the context of this debate, Dr. Ambedkar goes into the issue, a risk that he identifies in the working of the Constitution until then, in those intervening years, where he says that there is a situation where the minorities, in this context he actually speaks of linguistic minorities. In a linguistic state, there can be linguistic minorities whose rights may be suppressed by the linguistic majority. In a situation like that, Dr. Ambedkar says in his debate, there should be a right for the minorities within a state to represent directly to the governor of that state. And the governor should have the right to take action pursuant to such a representation. Of course, this was not in keeping with the powers and functions of the governor as envisaged in the Constitution, which Dr. Ambedkar had architected, so to speak. And this point was raised by other members also. Dr. Ambedkar says, now, sir, we have inherited a tradition. People always keep on saying to me, oh, you are the maker of the Constitution. My answer is, I was a hack. What I was asked to do, I did much against my will. Another member named Shri Sundaraya says, why did you do so? I'm putting it politely. He said it in a much harsher language. Another member says, but you defended it. Dr. Ambedkar says, we lawyers defend many things. Dr. K.N. Kadju, another member, says, my answer is that you have drafted this Constitution. And Dr. Ambedkar asks, you want to accuse me for your blemishes? And then the chairman interferes and says, he has said that he has defended the present Constitution because it was the majority decision. To me, this is important. Of course, there are always 2 ways to look at these statements. But fundamentally, my interpretation of this evolution of the drafting of the Constitution is that, on one hand, there was a clear notion of what an Ambedkarite Constitution would have been. You need to go no further than to look at the article States and Minorities of the year 1947 for it. Despite that, despite being the chairman of the drafting committee and having a lot of his own suggestions rejected, Dr. Ambedkar continued and presided over the process and steered the Constitution in a way that reflected the majority consensus of the Constituent Assembly. To me, that comes back to the question of patriotism. What is patriotism? And there's a statement here which I'll close with, an extract from his submissions before the Roundtable Conference, where again he comes to the question of one man, one value. Because the idea of state socialism is rooted in the idea of one man, one value. The state should interfere to create a society where one man is not just one vote, but every human being has equal value. Going back again to 1932, India is a peculiar country, and her nationalists and patriots are a peculiar people. A patriot and a nationalist in India is one who sees with open eyes his fellow men treated as being less than men, but his humanity does not rise in protest. He knows that men and women for no cause are denied their human rights, but does not pick up his civic sense to helpful action. He finds whole classes of people shut down and out from public employment, but it does not rouse his sense of injustice or justice and fair play. The patriot's one cry is power, and more power for him and for his class. I am glad I do not belong to that class of patriots. I belong to that class which takes its stand on democracy and which seeks to destroy monopoly in every shape and form. Our aim is to realize in practice our ideal of one man and one value in all walks of life, political, economic, and social. This concept of one man, one value has remained a thread in all of the arguments, as we can see, of Dr. Ambedkar's imagination of the Constitution of India, and from 1932 to 1947 and beyond. And so I would close this short discussion on what an Ambedkarite constitutionalism is by pointing out that maybe an Ambedkarite constitution would have been on the lines of what Dr. Ambedkar submitted in States and Minorities. But an Ambedkarite constitutionalism is one which works towards building a society where one man has one value, and a constitutionalism where compromise is acceptable in order to make society work. And for that reason, I would say I would give credit to Dr. Ambedkar, maybe not as the author of the Constitution, but as the architect of the Constitution, and one of the biggest reasons why, till today, it remains a live Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Prem. It was very interesting to hear you. Now I would request the chairman of the English Club to honor our guest. Now I invite our member of the English Club, Madam Rushi, to offer the vote of thanks.
Living in a state of gratitude is a gateway to grace. Good evening, everyone. Today, I am here to express my heartfelt thanks to all those who have made this event a great success. First and foremost, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to Advocate Mr.Prem Ayyathurai for his thoughtful words on the topic Ambedkarian Constitutionalism. Thank you, sir. Next, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our President, Senior Advocate Mr. Isaac Mohanlal. Your able guidance has always encouraged us. Thank you, sir. Next, I would like to thank Dr. Gnanasekaran, the Chairman, English Literary Club, for being the backbone of this event. Thank you, sir. I would like to express my sincere thanks to the librarian of MMBA, Advocate Mohammed Atif. Thank you, sir. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all office bearers and all members for your valuable presence. Thank you.